Judge Walter Grayson thought he was dealing with just another clueless teenager. Until that teenager started tearing apart the case like he'd been doing it for years. The atmosphere inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was tense. The air felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on everyone in the room. Courtroom gallery was packed, with rows of spectators whispering quietly as they watched the drama unfold. Over at the defense table stood a young man who looked far too small for the space he was in. He had his hands tucked in his pockets, head held high just enough to show he wasn't scared. His name was Jalen Dawson, 19 years old. He was facing serious charges, grand theft auto and resisting arrest, but anyone watching closely could tell Judge Grayson wasn't just putting Jalen on trial for breaking the law. It felt more personal than that. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping slowly on the polished wooden desk. He stared down at Jalen over the top of his glasses, his mouth curving into something between a smirk and a sneer. "So, you think you're some kind of legal genius?" he asked, with a dry chuckle in his voice. "This isn't your high school debate club, kid." Laughter spread through the courtroom. The bailiff cracked a grin, the court stenographer glanced up, and even the prosecutor let out a small laugh. Everyone seemed to be in on the joke, everyone except Jalen. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He didn't look nervous. Jalen had been preparing for something like this his entire life. Not exactly this situation. He never thought he'd be standing in court as a defendant, but he knew this environment like it was second nature. While other teenagers were memorizing sports stats or zoning out on video games, Jalen was studying case law and playing out pretend trials in his mind. He wasn't pretending to be a lawyer. He was becoming one in his own way. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. Every day, she came home with stories about how prosecutors cut corners, how some judges showed clear favoritism, and how too many defense lawyers barely did their jobs. Jalen soaked up every detail. By the time he was just 14, he could take apart a court case better than most law students, but none of that seemed to matter to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another young guy who got into trouble. "Nothing more. Let's get this over with," the judge muttered as he opened Jalen's file. "I've got a tea time at 2. The audience laughed again, but this time something shifted. Jalen's mouth curled into the tiniest smirk, almost invisible, but it was there because Judge Grayson had just made his first real mistake, but no one in the courtroom had caught on yet. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, stood up from his seat like he already had the verdict in his pocket. His suit looked freshly pressed, his tie perfectly straight. He had the confident tone of a man who had delivered this kind of argument at least 100 times before. "Your Honor," he began, voice clear and polished, "the state intends to prove, without a doubt, that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught in the act, behind the wheel of a stolen car." He paused for effect. "A 2022 Audi S6, he continued, reported stolen just hours before Jalen's arrest. Police chased him through downtown. He tried to get away, but they caught him. And when they checked the car, his fingerprints were on the steering wheel." Carrington nodded as if it was already over. "The evidence speaks for itself." The words hit hard. People in the courtroom shifted in their seats, murmuring quietly to each other. On the surface, everything sounded convincing. Stolen vehicle, high-speed chase, attempted escape. Judge Grayson looked over the top of his glasses at Jalen, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on," he said. Carrington moved toward the jury box, each step making a crisp click on the courtroom floor. His voice remained smooth, controlled. "The defense may try to spin this," he said, gesturing lightly. "They might suggest that Mr. Dawson was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That this is all a big mistake. A misunderstanding." He turned his gaze directly at Jalen, locking eyes with him for the first time. "But let's be honest," Carrington added sharply. "What kind of innocent person runs from the police?" You could feel the tension in the air. It was thick, heavy. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, eyes now fixed on Jalen. Still, Jalen didn't move. He just watched. Carrington kept going, flipping through a file of documents. "Your Honor," he said, holding one up. "This is the official statement from Officer Daniel Ruiz, the arresting officer. He saw Jalen behind the wheel. He witnessed him trying to flee. The vehicle had been confirmed stolen and everything was done by the book. Judge Grayson gave a small nod and exhaled through his nose. Sounds pretty clear to me. And to most of the people sitting in that room, it probably did seem simple. A stolen car, a police pursuit, an arrest, but Jalen had spent too many years studying how court cases work to accept things at face value. He saw the holes that others didn't. Still, he didn't say a word. He waited. Judge Grayson lightly tapped his gavel. "All right," he said. "Let's hear from the defense." He turned his attention to Jalen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken since the hearing began. She slowly got to her feet, clearly uneasy. "Your Honor, my client—" She didn't get to finish. Jalen gently placed a hand on her arm. It was quiet but firm. She hesitated, then sat back down, and for the first time Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went completely silent. Judge Grayson blinked, surprised, and gave him a long look. There was something close to amusement in his eyes. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm. "Teddy, I'll be defending myself." A quiet wave of surprise rolled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff raised his eyebrows. Mitchell Carrington's smug grin flickered, just for a second, before he gave a short laugh. "Well, this should be interesting," he muttered, but the room wasn't laughing anymore when Jalen Dawson stepped forward because something was shifting. As Jalen moved into place, the mood in the courtroom changed. The air felt heavier. He stood tall, calm, hands still in his pockets, and waited just a little longer before speaking. Long enough for everyone to start feeling the silence. Then he finally broke it. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "Before I begin, I'd like to clear something up with the prosecution." Carrington crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Jalen slowly walked forward, keeping his pace deliberate. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, right?" Carrington let out a breath, sounding impatient. "That's correct." "And that's what he wrote in his official report?" "Of course it is." Jalen nodded once, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to have that part of the testimony removed from evidence." Grayson leaned forward slightly, squinting. "On what grounds?" For the first time, Jalen took his hands out of his pockets and motioned toward Carrington's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that vehicle," he said calmly. "He wasn't even on duty when the chase started." Carrington's face twitched with confusion. "What are you talking about?" Jalen took another measured step. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to make a formal request to review Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report is accurate, if he really saw me in that car, then his location data will match." He paused for just a beat, "But something tells me it won't." Whispers started rippling through the gallery now, louder than before. Judge Grayson looked toward Carrington, frowning. Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening as he spoke. "Your Honor, that report was filed by a sworn officer. Are we seriously going to trust a defendant's word over a trained professional?" Jalen responded with a small, relaxed shrug. "If Officer Ruiz was where he said he was, the GPS will back him up. And if he wasn't—" He let the sentence drift, unfinished, but the meaning was clear. Grayson stared at Jalen for a long moment, then slowly turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS records?" Carrington paused. "It wasn't long, but it was long enough. The jury noticed. People in the gallery noticed. And most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed." Jalen stayed quiet, steady. He had seen this kind of thing before. He had studied courtroom tactics for years. He knew how prosecutors worked the system. And one thing was always true: if Carrington had nothing to hide, he wouldn't be hesitating. Judge Grayson sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Counselor." Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But by now, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. For the first time, there were no more chuckles or side comments. The room was quiet, but the silence felt loud. Carrington shuffled through his stack of papers, that polished, confident look he always wore starting to fade. "Your Honor," he said, trying to regain control. "While we wait for the GPS records, one thing still stands. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen gave a small nod, his expression calm and unreadable. "That's true," he said, stepping forward. "But let's take a closer look at that evidence." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow and motioned for him to go on. Jalen turned to face the jury. Slowly, he looked each juror in the eye, making sure they were with him. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my fingerprints being on the car means I stole it," Jalen said. "That's what they're trying to sell you." He paused, then continued in an even, steady tone, "But let's use some common sense here. Let's say you go into a department store. You try on a jacket, maybe stick your hands in the pockets, zip it up to see how it fits. Then you put it back on the rack and leave." He took a breath. "Now imagine someone comes in hours later and steals that same jacket. Just because your fingerprints are on it, does that mean you're guilty of the theft?" A few jurors looked at one another. Someone in the back row of the gallery whispered something under their breath. Jalen didn't slow down. "The car the state is talking about? It was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before it was supposedly stolen. I was there with 3 friends. And yes, when we passed the car, I leaned on it. I opened the door too, it wasn't even locked." He glanced at the jury again. "I didn't steal the car. I didn't drive off with it. I didn't even take anything from inside. It was a stupid moment of curiosity, nothing more." He let the room sit with that for a moment, then he spoke again, this time more firmly. "Does touching something automatically make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, trying to find something, anything, to get back in control, but Jalen wasn't done. "And since we're on the topic," he said, turning back toward the judge, "let's talk about how that fingerprint evidence was handled." He looked at Judge Grayson directly. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case ever brought in to testify?" Grayson blinked, clearly caught off guard. He turned to Carrington. Carrington hesitated for a second. Then he answered, not looking too pleased. "No." Jalen pressed his lips together and gave a short nod. "So just to be clear, the state is trying to convict me using forensic evidence, but they didn't bother to call the actual specialist who processed it? No chance for me to question them, ask about how the evidence was handled, or if anything could have been misread." Carrington's jaw tensed. Jalen took that in like it told him everything he needed to know. "Interesting," he said. Judge Grayson let out a long breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man starting to realize something was off. This case wasn't turning out to be the easy win Carrington had expected, but Jalen wasn't finished yet. What he said next would change everything. He stepped forward slowly. His voice was clear and steady, but carried weight. "Your Honor," he began, "I'd like to submit an official statement into evidence. It's from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson looked up, his brow furrowed. "The owner?" Jalen gave a firm nod. "Yes, sir. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the 2022 Audi A6. He gave a statement to the police. But for some reason, it was never included in the prosecution's evidence." He paused, then turned directly toward Carrington. "And I think I know why." Carrington's jaw tensed. He knew what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for a reply. He opened a folder, pulled out a printed transcript, and began reading aloud. "I left my car running when I went inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and drove off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. He was white." A sharp gasp moved through the courtroom. Jalen held up the paper for everyone to see. "That's straight from the original police report. The same report the prosecution decided not to bring up." He looked directly at Judge Grayson again. "The arresting officer left that out of his testimony. Prosecution ignored it completely. And yet they're asking this jury to believe without question that I'm guilty." He paused. "Even though I don't match the description at all." Carrington stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, that information is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the stolen car." But Jalen shook his head calmly and firmly. "No, I wasn't." He didn't raise his voice, but every word hit hard. "I was arrested several blocks away from where the car was left. I was walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't anywhere near it. I wasn't running." He took a breath. "The only reason I'm here is because of sloppy police work and assumptions." Judge Grayson slowly exhaled and rubbed his temple. The case was falling apart, and everyone in the room could feel it. Jalen turned to the jury one last time. "The real thief got away that night. But the police found a black teenager nearby and decided that was close enough. That's what this whole thing is really about. Silence followed. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and looked to Carrington. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington stood stiffly, his face red with frustration. No, Your Honor. Grayson took a moment. He looked at Jalen, then at the jury, then leaned forward and said the words that would stick in everyone's mind: case dismissed. The room froze in silence. Then, all at once, chaos. Half the courtroom erupted. Some in shock, others in quiet relief. The gallery was buzzing. Reporters were busy scribbling notes, pens moving fast across notepads. Jalen didn't rush to leave. He stood still, letting the moment sink in, for the jury, for the crowd, for the court itself. Judge Grayson still had his hand wrapped around the gavel, staring at Jalen with a look that was hard to read. But in his eyes there was something new, something that hadn't been there before: recognition. Maybe even regret. Jalen met his gaze without flinching, then turned toward the courtroom door. He was just about to walk out when the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen paused but didn't turn around. There was a brief silence before Grayson added, You should think about going to law school. A faint smirk crossed Jalen's face. He didn't have to think about it. He was already headed in that direction. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was loud. Reporters filled the steps, voices overlapping, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward him from every angle. Jalen, did you know the judge was going to throw out the case? What's your next move? How does it feel to outsmart a veteran prosecutor? Jalen pulled his hoodie up over his head and kept walking. He didn't answer. He wasn't there for attention, and this wasn't about showing off. For him, it had always been about something bigger. Down at the bottom of the steps, his mother, Denise, was waiting. She stood with her arms folded, her face serious. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, eyes filled with something deeper than anger or pride. Then she shook her head slowly and let out a sigh. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jalen let out a quiet laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Had to take the chance, Ma. She gave him a long look before pulling him into a strong hug. You always were the stubborn one, she said. The cameras kept flashing, but Jalen had tuned them out. None of that mattered anymore. Across the street, near his parked car, Judge Grayson stood watching, but he looked different now. The usual smugness was gone. His posture had changed. His expression was no longer amused. It was thoughtful. He hadn't expected this case to be anything special, just another file. Another young man. Another guilty plea, but this one would stay with him because Jalen had done something that most people never get the chance to do. He made the system look at itself, and this time it was the system that backed down. There's a lesson in all of this. How many times had cases like this one ended the wrong way? How many people had been convicted, not because the evidence proved it, but because of assumptions? Because someone rushed through the process, cared more about closing the case than getting it. Right? Jalen had the knowledge to defend himself. But what about the ones who don't? This wasn't just about his case, it was about all the others like it, and Jalen understood exactly what he needed to do next. This wouldn't be the last courtroom he'd stand in, but next time, he wouldn't be sitting at the defendant's table. He'd be standing as the attorney, and when that day came, he wouldn't be alone. If this story made you stop and think, even for a second, then maybe that's the beginning of something. To go ahead, share this story. The justice system may be based on rules and laws, but at the end of the day, it's run by people. And people can change, but only if we push them to. If this made you think, hit that like button. Subscribe for more real stories that matter. Let's keep the conversation going, because next time it might not be Jalen. Could be someone you know.